Okay, so you want to own a Christmas tree farm. Rows of blue-green firs marching up a hillside in perfectly straight lines. A hand-painted sign that says, choose and cut, nailed to a fence post. A rusted orange tractor pulling a hay wagon full of families in flannel. A barrel fire with a dented percolator of cider sitting on top of it. A cash box with a roll of 20s and a spool of orange twine next to the bow saws. You picture families driving out from town every November, wandering your rows with a thermos of cocoa, cutting down their own tree and paying you $80 for something that cost you a few cents and a little dirt. It looks like the closest thing left in American agriculture to printing money out of a hillside. And it isn't a delusion. People really do pay that. Families really do drive out from town for it. The tree really did start as a few cents of seed and a hole in the ground. Here's the problem: every one of those families is paying you for a tree that took the better part of a decade to grow, and you had to decide blind, all the way back at the beginning, that they'd still want it when it was finally ready. Here's where most people stop thinking about this business. They stop at the sign, the cider, the $20 bills. They never ask what happens in the 9 years before that scene is possible, or what happens to a farmer who guessed wrong about what the market would look like once the trees were finally tall enough to sell. A Christmas tree farm is not really an agriculture business. It's a single, uninsurable bet on human taste, placed 9 years before you find out whether you won. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how that bet is priced, what it costs to place it, and why so many people who placed it responsibly still lost money without ever seeing a single dead tree. Let's start with what you're actually buying into, because Christmas Tree Farm is doing a lot of work covering up at least 5 different businesses. There's the choose and cut operation, the one in your head, a retail farm where families walk the rows, cut their own tree, and pay you close to full retail value, somewhere near the national average of $84 a tree, plus whatever wreaths, hot cider, and wagon rides you sell them on the way out. You keep almost all of that revenue because there's no wholesaler and no retailer standing between you and the customer. There's the wholesale field grown operation, which never sees a single family. You grow trees at scale and sell them, often while still standing in the field, to brokers, retail lots, or big box chains at a wholesale price. That's a fraction of what the consumer eventually pays. The documented 2009 farm gate price for a top grade Oregon Douglas fir was just over $10 a tree. The consumer paying $84 for a similar tree today is paying the retailer's markup, not yours. There's the pre-cut retail lot, which isn't really farming at all. Someone buys wholesale trees by the truckload and resells them off a parking lot, capturing a retail markup that industry reporting consistently describes as 100% or more, without ever tying up capital in 9 years of land and labor. There's the potted or living tree operation, selling a tree with an intact root ball meant to be replanted after the holiday, a small, higher price point niche, and, worth noting, a legally different category of plant. Oregon's property tax code, for instance, exempts trees traditionally considered part of the soil, and a court has specifically excluded stock grown in movable containers from that exemption. The living tree business isn't just a different product. In some states, it's a different tax category. And there's the wreath and greenery operation, which doesn't sell trees at all. It sells the boughs, the same genetics, the same acreage, an entirely different product line built out of what shearing leaves on the ground. Each of these is a different bet on the same underlying land. Which one you're actually running changes almost every number that follows. Now, the part almost nobody budgets correctly at the start: the land itself. The US national average value of cropland in 2025 is $5,830 an acre, according to USDA's own land value survey. And that's before you've planted anything, before you've built a single access road, before a single seedling is in the ground. Say you plant at a working density of somewhere between 1,200 and 2,700 trees per acre, depending on species and final spacing. The specific studies used here worked with roughly 1,000 to 2,100 trees planted per acre. At 50 cents to a dollar per seedling, that's somewhere in the range of $750 to $2,000 in seedlings alone per acre before labor. Add site preparation, stump removal if the ground was previously timbered, and the first year of establishment labor, and one documented Oregon case landed at roughly $2,700 per acre just to get year one finished. And that's a 2009 figure. Input costs have not gone down since. Here's the cost that catches almost every new grower off guard, and it isn't on any equipment list. It's underground, and you can't see it until it's already too late to fix. It's called Phytophthora root rot, and it's not an insect and it's not a fungus you can spray away. It's a soil-borne water mold that rots root systems in ground that doesn't drain well, and it specifically kills Fraser fir, which happens to be the single most valuable Christmas tree species in the eastern half of this country. North Carolina State University's own extension guidance for growers facing this disease is blunt. Once you lose trees to it, don't replant Fraser fir in that same ground. The new seedlings face the exact same risk the old ones did. This isn't a bill you pay and move past. It's a permanent downgrade of what that specific patch of dirt is allowed to grow, decided by drainage you didn't test carefully enough 9 years before you find out it mattered. Stack it up: land, seedlings, site prep, first year labor, and the drainage testing you'd be foolish to skip. On a modest 10-acre start, you are somewhere in the range of $60,000 to $90,000 before a single tree is tall enough to sell, and that range assumes land you already own or finance separately. Add the land purchase at the national average, and a 10-acre entry can run well past $100,000 before you've made a dollar. Now, here's a question. Picture two Christmas tree farms, side by side, same acreage, same species, same 7 years. At the end of year 7, Farm A's owner checks the bank account and it's basically flat, a few $100s ahead of where they started. Farm B's owner checks the same account and it's also basically flat. Which farm actually made money? Trick question. Neither of them tells you the answer because a flat bank balance and real profit are not the same measurement, and the gap between them is the entire hidden engine of this business. Here's the problem with checking your bank account: it only counts cash moving in and cash moving out. It never asks what else that money could have been doing for the 7 to 10 years it was sitting in the ground as a tree instead of sitting in almost any other investment on earth. Oregon State University's own applied economics department tracked exactly this, acre by acre, for a real Douglas fir stand over its full 7-year cycle. Cumulative net cash flow across those 7 years, plus $161.73 an acre. Genuinely, almost exactly break even. If you were the grower checking your account, you'd shrug and say, fine, we didn't lose anything. Now here's the number sitting right next to it in the same study: cumulative economic return across those same 7 years, on that same acre. Once you count what the capital tied up in land, seedlings, and labor could have earned doing literally anything else for 7 years, negative $8,805.49. Read that again. Same farm, same 7 years, same trees in the same ground. One measurement says you broke even. The other says you lost nearly $9,000 an acre. Both are true at the same time because they're measuring completely different things. One measures whether cash physically left your account faster than it came in, and the other measures whether the whole 7-year project was actually worth doing compared to literally not doing it. The study's own conclusion, in its own words, at the prices built into that model, the farm will not generate sufficient gross incomes to cover all economic costs. Prices would have needed to rise by roughly 64% for that operation to actually clear its true economic cost, not just survive on paper. That's the hidden engine of a Christmas tree farm. It is a business specifically structured so that the number you're most likely to check, is there money in the account, is the number least likely to tell you whether the last 7 years were a good idea. So far, so good. Now, let's talk about what actually happens during those 7 to 10 years, because a Christmas tree isn't a single harvest, it's a rolling one. Here's the structural fork almost nobody explains up front. If you want to sell trees every single year, not just once, 7 years from now, all at once, you cannot plant one field and wait. You have to plant a new block every year. so that by year 7 or 8, you have a different age class of trees maturing on a rolling basis every season. A grower harvesting roughly 10 acres worth of mature trees a year on a 7-year rotation needs something closer to 70 acres total in various stages of growth at any given moment. 10 acres of income, 7 times that much land and capital tied up and growing at every stage all at once. This is the single biggest reason new growers underestimate the scale of the operation. They price out the harvest year and forget they need 6 more years of standing inventory behind it just to keep selling every November. Every one of those 70 acres needs the same recurring bills on a schedule that doesn't care what the market looks like when the trees are finally ready. Roughly $25 an acre a year in herbicide for the first 7 years. Fertilizer that starts at nothing in the first 2 years climbs to around $200 an acre a year by years 3 through 6 and tapers off after that. And then shearing, the annual pruning that turns a scraggly conifer into something shaped like the tree in your head, running 25 to 55 cents per tree every single year from year 3 through year 7. Skip shearing 1 year to save the labor cost. And the tree you get in year 7 isn't a cheaper version of a good tree. It's a different, lower grade of tree because USDA's own grading standard for Christmas trees is built almost entirely around density and shape. US Premium allows barely any visible defect. US number 1 allows a bit more. US number 2 allows more still. A single skipped year of shearing, 7 years before the sale, is the difference between a premium tree and a discount one, and you don't find out which one you grew until the tree is already tall. Here's the deep cut almost nobody outside the industry knows about, and it's a regulatory one. If you sell more than 500 trees a year, or import more than 500, federal law requires you to pay into something called the Christmas Tree Promotion, Research and Information Order, a mandatory federal checkoff of 15 cents per tree, due every February 15th, that funds the industry's own generic advertising. And that's just the federal layer. Ship trees across a state line, and you typically need a state plant health certificate, documented at $50 a year in Wisconsin. Plus, depending on where you're shipping from and to, a separate spongy moth quarantine compliance agreement because that pest is under active federal quarantine control in parts of the country. None of this shows up in the brochure about owning a tree farm. Every one of these fees is small on its own. Together, they're the toll booth nobody mentions standing at every state line a truckload of trees has to cross. And then there's weather and biology, which don't send you a bill, they just take the crop. Newly planted seedlings are especially vulnerable to drought. Late spring frost is a serious risk, specifically in the harvest year, when a damaged tip can ruin the shape you spent 6 years building. Deer browse the tips and trample seedlings. And even in a completely normal year, not every tree you planted grades as sellable at harvest. Documented Virginia data puts marketability at roughly 60% for Scotch pine, 75% for white pine, 75 to 80% for spruce, and 80 to 85% for fir. In other words, even the best performing species in that data set loses one tree in 6 or 7 between the ground and the truck in a year where nothing unusual happened at all. Now let's talk about what happens when something unusual does happen at industry scale, because this already happened once. And it's one of the cleaner structural failures in modern American agriculture. Go back to 2008 and 2009. The recession hit, consumer spending dropped, and growers who had trees ready to sell couldn't move them at a price that covered what they'd spent growing them. So growers did the economically rational thing. They planted fewer new trees the following year. Nobody was being reckless. Nobody was being greedy. They looked at a crop they couldn't currently sell at a profit and made the obvious call: plant less of it. Here's the catch nobody accounted for. A Christmas tree takes roughly 7 to 10 years to reach a sellable 6 or 7 feet. So that entirely rational decision not to plant in 2008 and 2009 didn't show up as a problem in 2008 or 2009. It showed up years later when those underplanted years should have been reaching maturity and weren't. By the mid 2000s, US Christmas tree acreage and production had fallen more than 30% from its early 2000s level. The average national retail price more than doubled between 2008 and 2016, hitting $74.70 a tree by 2016. And in Oregon, the largest Christmas tree producing state in the country, historically supplying something like a third of the national market. Growers who'd pulled out unprofitable tree ground didn't leave it empty. Some of it went into wine grapes. And after Oregon legalized cannabis in 2015, some of that same ground went into cannabis, a crop that turns over in a single season instead of a decade. Let that land for a moment. A shortage that showed up in stores in 2015, 2016, 2017 wasn't caused by anything that happened in 2015, 2016, or 2017. It was caused by a planting decision from 2008 and 2009 that nobody could revise once it was made because the tree's own biological clock doesn't take instructions. The math didn't break because anyone was foolish. It broke because this is a business where today's planting decision is actually a demand forecast for a Christmas 9 years away. And there is no version of this industry where you get to update that forecast once the seedlings are in the ground. Let's do the actual math on what a tree costs to grow versus what it sells for, because this is where the different business models from the beginning of this video stop being abstract. The two most complete life cycle cost studies available, one Michigan, one Oregon, put total per acre production cost from planting through harvest at $4,030 an acre for a 750 tree Scotch pine stand in Michigan and $6,249 an acre for a 1,350 tree Douglas fir stand in Oregon. Divide those totals by the trees actually harvested, and you land somewhere around $5 a tree in production cost. Call it $4.63 to $5.37 in the dollars those studies were measured in. Even generously adjusting for how much input costs have climbed since those figures were published, growing a Christmas tree is not, by itself, an expensive thing to do per tree. It never was. Here's what actually separates a farm that makes money from one that doesn't. Not the cost of growing the tree, but who's standing between you and the person who buys it. A wholesale grower selling into the supply chain at something close to the documented 2009 farm gate price of $10 a tree for a top grade is clearing a real but thin margin over that roughly $5 production cost. A choose and cut grower selling the identical tree in the identical season directly to a family standing in their own field is capturing something much closer to the full national retail average, $83.87 in 2025, for a tree that cost roughly the same $5 to grow. Industry reporting consistently describes retail lots marking up wholesale trees 100% or more before reselling them to the public. That markup exists because someone is willing to pay it. The only question is whether that someone is paying you directly or paying a retailer who bought your tree from you for a fraction of what they're about to charge for it. This is why so many small tree farms specifically build the whole operation around choose and cut, cider, wagon rides, and wreaths instead of trucking trees to a broker. It's the same acre, the same 7 years, the same $5 production cost. The only variable that moves is how many hands the tree passes through before it reaches the person who actually wanted it. But, and this matters, capturing retail price requires people to physically drive to your farm in November in whatever weather shows up that year. And that's not free either. It's marketing spend. It's staffing a farm stand on weekends for 6 weeks a year, and it's a customer base that has to exist within a reasonable drive of wherever your 70 acres happen to be. So let's put the two futures next to each other because this is where all of it lands. In the optimistic scenario, your rotation is fully staggered, so you're harvesting a consistent block every year instead of waiting 7 years for one big payday. Your marketability rate sits at the high end of the documented range, comfortably above 80%, consistent with a well managed fur stand. You're selling direct at or near the $83.87 national retail average, and you've layered in wreaths, garland, and on site sales that ride along on the same visit. Under those conditions, this is a genuinely good business. The choose and cut model captures real retail value on a crop that costs a few dollars a tree to grow, and the annual cash flow, once the rotation matures, can look nothing like the 7-year OSU case study we walked through earlier. In the realistic scenario, 2 or 3 completely ordinary things go wrong at once. Your marketability rate lands in the middle of the documented range instead of the top. Some deer damage. A dry planting year 3 seasons back. A patch of ground that turned out to drain worse than you thought. A regional oversupply, or just a soft economy, compresses the price you can charge, the way it demonstrably has before in this exact industry. And you're competing for a shrinking share of a market where 83% of tree displaying households in 2025 chose an artificial tree over a real one. A structural headwind on total demand that has nothing to do with how well you grew your trees. No fire, no bankruptcy filing, no single dramatic event, just a slightly lower marketability rate, a slightly softer price, and a slightly smaller share of a slowly shrinking category, compounding quietly across the exact 7 to 10 year window where you can't do anything to speed up or fix the trees already in the ground. The gap between those two futures isn't hypothetical. It already happened once, at the scale of an entire industry, acreage down more than 30% and retail price more than doubled. Inside 8 years, driven by a planting decision nobody could take back once it was made. You didn't plant a tree. You placed a bet 9 years ago on a hillside about what a family you've never met would want to pay for on one specific weekend this November. This is the weekend you find out if you won, and if you lost, if the marketability rate came in low, if the price softened, if the math looked more like negative $8,805 an acre than plus $161. You already know what you're going to do next spring. You're going to plant it again.